South Africa is currently struggling from record high levels of poverty and unemployment, resulting in millions of people being mired in poverty. The government's solution to this is a concept called Black economic empowerment, which seeks to identify disadvantage on the basis of race and allocate benefits according to racial criteria. But are there any other ways in which people could be economically uplifted without using race as the primary mode of assessment? Well, Anthea Jeffery, who is the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations, has an alternative policy proposal which does not use race as the primary proxy for disadvantage. Anthea joins me today. Anthea, welcome to the Solutions with David Ansara podcast.
Thank you, David.
So, Anthea, let's start with understanding BEE itself. How did it come about? What is it intending to achieve? And what are some of the problems and limitations of the policy?
Well, that's a big question, but let's really go a little bit back into the history, just for context, that by the end of the 1960s, the South African economy had grown so fast that it was clear that the white population was not large enough to meet the needs of that economy. And so business leaders increasingly put pressure on the National Party government to improve Black education and also to allow more Black people to be appointed to supervisory and managerial posts. And from 1973, John Vorster, the then Prime Minister, said he would no longer stand in the way of that kind of Black advancement. And so we did see improvements to Black education. We did see many more Black people coming into more senior positions and a significant increase in Black earnings and so on. And that process, of course, accelerated after 1994 when a Black government was elected into power. And many of the biggest enterprises in the private sector embarked on what they called a soft form of affirmative action. Their aim was to fast track the training, the mentoring of their Black employees so that as many as possible could move into middle and senior positions, but in an organic way and in a way that made sense to all the individuals involved. The government seemed to become impatient with that approach. It decided that we needed to have legislation. So we had the Employment Equity Act of 1998, which came into force in 1999. And this talks about racial targets, but now these are racial targets which have the backing of sanctions, punishments behind them, quite substantial fines at this point, up to 10% of turnover, which is a massive penalty for repeat offenses. So effectively, what had been an approach aimed at trying to speed up Black advancement in an organic and pragmatic way became overtaken by policies aimed at penalizing business if they didn't meet particular targets, effectively quotas. Now the government is going further and it wants the Minister of Employment and Labour to have the possibility to set what those targets should be for business in different sectors. And that's under the Employment Equity Amendment Bill, which is now before Parliament. In the BEE sphere, you saw something rather similar with the first BEE ownership deals being done before 1994, in fact, with some of the big corporations transferring subsidiaries to Black investors on preferential terms. Again, the government began to indicate that this was not enough, that it wanted not only deals, but also a big emphasis on preferential procurement, that the state would use its purchasing power to make sure that many of those contracts went to Black businesses. And this was enshrined in law again in the Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003, and also in a Preferential Procurement Policy Act, which came in 2000. So now we had, on top of the steps that business was taking in any event, two major legislative interventions, the Employment Equity Act and BEE in its various dimensions, but with the most significant probably being the BEE deals and the preferential procurement. And the IRR is well aware that where these kinds of affirmative action policies have been applied in other countries, where they use race or ethnicity as the foundation for them, what generally happens is that a very small pool of the most credentialed people, generally the most skilled, the most politically connected, are the ones who benefit from these policies, and the great majority do not. So here in South Africa, we wanted to find out whether the same sort of dynamic was playing out. And the best way to do that is actually to go and ask ordinary people, what is their experience of employment equity and BEE? So we've been commissioning opinion polls from a very reputable agency, Mark Data, for a number of years. In 2015 and 2016, we asked people, Black respondents, what's your experience? And we found in rough terms that 15% said that they benefited either from employment equity or BEE deals or contracts, and 85% said they did not. So again, a confirmation that the benefit of these policies, which the ANC posits as the only way in which Black people can advance, is going only to a small group, and the great majority are not benefiting from them at all. So there's a sort of irony that the ANC denies what was in place, what was happening for decades before 1994, and was continuing on an organic basis. It wants Black people to be grateful for the race-based laws that it has introduced, which it says are the only foundation for upward mobility, contradicting the experience of the past. And it refuses to acknowledge really the fact that those laws only benefit about 15% of Black South Africans, and the remaining 85% simply have no opportunity of getting access to the management jobs or the BEE deals or the preferential tenders from the state or others. And so we have, in fact, a widening inequality within the Black population, with a small number of millionaires and billionaires, and at the same time, more than 9 million Black people who are unemployed and have, of course, a situation of almost no income, perhaps some reliance on social grants through children or parents, but really no capacity to earn their own living. And that seems a very strange form of empowerment, to insist on policies that help the few and actually harm the many.
Yeah, Anthea, I think one of the problems is that it engenders a sense of dependency on the state. And as you argued, the ANC, it's in their interest to portray economic advancement as being conditional on government intervention rather than through pursuing the profit motive or through developing products or services that help people or of value to consumers. So, I mean, there's this problem of elite enrichment, and that's obviously driven by a political interest. But what are some of the other ways in which the political class in South Africa kind of perpetuates this idea of BEE?
Right. Well, it's the most politically connected that benefit the most. So obviously there's a strong vested interest there. And if you want to give a most practical example, we can think of Ace Magashule's, one of his sons, who last year was able to obtain a PPE contract with a supply of face masks and soap to the Free State Provincial Administration, where his father had been premier for many years. And within a week of that contract being awarded to his company, of which he is the sole director, he was able to go out and buy a 2 million rand BMW, which creates all sorts of questions as to whether the pricing was correct, whether there had in fact been the fraud and inflated pricing of which the National Treasury has often expressed concern in the context of preferential procurement. So we have people who are politically connected being obviously the ones that benefit. There's a concern as well that some of the kickbacks from contracts flow back to the ANC, help to sustain a patronage machine which keeps the party in power, helps to keep its cadres happy. And yet we see at the same time an enormous damage to ordinary people. In fact, it's not just that they're being left out, it's worse than that. Take again, I beg your pardon, the Ace Magashule contract. If the prices were inflated, then obviously the Free State government then has less money left over to contract with somebody else for the supply of face masks and so. So the people who most need the benefit of those goods and services are in fact being shortchanged. Too much money is going to a small group of people and not enough is left over to meet all the other needs through contracts concluded on a more economic and cost-effective basis. So we have the problem there very much of entrenched interests. There are probably also ideological reasons why the government is very committed to BEE. But it's really important against this background to try and think about whether there are alternative ways of trying to empower people and what ordinary people think of them. So partly what we've been doing through our polling is to ask those sorts of questions as well. And if I could continue just to explain a little bit more, it seems to us that if you're going to have a new system of empowerment, one of the critical things it must do is to reach down to the grassroots, not to empower just the elite and turn many of them into millionaires and billionaires, but rather help the people right at the bottom of the pile, the truly disadvantaged. And one of the ways in which that could be done, for example, in the education context, is by recognizing people need better skills if they're going to be able to participate actively in the economy. But our schools, despite an enormous amount of money lavished on them, produce very poor results. We have a big dropout factor. Many people never even get through to matric. Those who do pass matric often are functionally literate and innumerate. Business finds it extremely difficult to provide training to people who've been so poorly prepared by the school system. And then when it comes to something as crucial as maths, it's only a tiny fraction of the more than 1 million children who start grade 1 in any given year who ultimately are able to pass maths with even 50% when they get to matric. It's about 4 or 5% of that more than 1 million are able to get matric maths at 50% or more. And that's a terrible attrition rate. So what can be done to improve schooling? And we know that there are various countries around the world that use education vouchers. They say, right, the state must fund education using the tax revenue that it collects, but it doesn't necessarily have to provide education. So one way of thinking about it is to take some of the tax revenue that's collected, and instead of paying it over to bureaucrats to run a school system rather badly, you turn it into vouchers, which go directly to the households which are most in need. And those households then have a choice as to what school they would like to send their children to. And it changes the whole balance of power in that the schools must now compete for the custom of those parents, which means that the school have an interest in being more efficient, and they have an interest in holding their costs down so that they can compete with others. Public schools have to start competing for the custom of these parents. And there's obviously an incentive for many more private schools to be established too, because now the voucher-bearing parent is a consumer with the capacity to pay for schooling. And the poor now have the same sort of choices available to them as the middle class do. And that seemed to us, again, something worth exploring. Would there be interest in South Africa in that sort of option? And one doesn't need to confine it just to education. One could do the same thing for healthcare. If people had, poor households had access to healthcare vouchers paid for out of tax revenues, they could join low-cost medical schemes. They could take out low-cost health insurance, and that would entitle them to access to primary healthcare in the private sector, which is so much better than the care available in the public, and would reduce the burden on the public. And you could do the same in housing, for example, where the government has been struggling to build enough RDP or BNG houses, as they're now called, where many of the houses that are built are so defective that many of them have to be really taken down and started again from scratch. And where people have been saying for years that they wish the government would give the housing subsidy to them directly because they could do so much of a better job in building houses for themselves with that same money. So in our polling, we've also started to ask people, what do they think about vouchers? And in the last poll that we did, which was in November and December 2020, we asked Black respondents if they would like to have an education voucher, tax-funded, so that they could send the children to the school of their choice. And 80% of Black respondents said yes, they would. And when we asked the same question about a healthcare voucher, it was 75% that said yes, and a housing voucher, 74%. And then when we asked people, would vouchers of this kind be more effective at helping you to get ahead than BEE? Again, it was 75% of Black respondents that said yes, the vouchers would be more helpful to them. Because I think ordinary Black people are very well aware they don't benefit from VEE. They don't get the advantage of the management jobs on offer through employment equity. But they could see the vouchers as something that would bring a tangible benefit that would give them the choices to send their children to a school that they think will do better, to take out some kind of low-cost medical scheme membership and have the same sort of choice available that the middle class now has, and so on. So we were encouraged by this, and we've been thinking for quite a long time about how one could develop an alternative empowerment policy. And it seems to us that it must have two dimensions. It must reach down to the grassroots. It must make a real difference in the lives of the people who need it most. And the people who need it most are people who are poor. So we can decide to whom the vouchers can go on the basis of socio-economic status, as we do with the social grants. We don't need to divide people up by race. We can simply look at who is in need and make sure that the vouchers go to them. And secondly, we need to make sure that the economy is growing faster. It's good for people to be better skilled, to be living in better conditions, to have better healthcare, but what they critically need is employment and income. And that's the other thing that our opinion polls have shown over many years, whereas as the government tries to pretend that racism is the most important problem confronting the country, when we give people the choice to identify for yourself, no prompting from us, what are the most important problems? 56% of Black respondents in this last survey said it's unemployment that's the biggest problem, and 3% said racism is a big problem. So you can see where people's priorities lie. If we're going to get unemployment resolved, we have to have growth, we have to have investment, and we will struggle to get investment and growth so long as we have our current BEE and employment equity policies. These are not replicated in other countries around the world, and they are like a huge tax imposed on business. And they simply mean that the foreign direct investment that we so urgently need, because our own savings are far too small to grow the economy in the way that we need, that foreign direct investment is likely to go elsewhere. South Africa makes up 0.4, 0.5% of the global economy. There are many other choices available elsewhere. And yet we impose this massive burden of BEE and employment equity for the benefit not of the poor, but of the 15% of the relative elite who are the ones who gain the advantage from it. So can we not think of a better way of doing that aspect of BEE? And we thought we should really have a different scorecard, something which is done on a voluntary basis, not a whole complexity of bureaucratic enforcement and compliance. But if business knew that they would get voluntary EED points for every rand that they invest in their businesses, and every time they help to bring money into the country, and for every person that they keep employed, and even more so for the additional people that they manage to employ, and also for the taxes that they pay, whether it's corporate tax or VAT or the PAYE, which is deducted from their employee salaries. It all goes to the government to help fund the education, housing, healthcare that all South Africans need. And we know that business puts a lot into research and development, and also often contributes to export earnings, and so helps sustain the value of the rand, etc. All these business contributions are enormously important. They're the most important contributions that business can possibly make. And we think that business should be recognized and rewarded for them through these EED points, and perhaps through a prize for the businesses, awards for the businesses that make the most contribution to investment, to employment, to tax revenues, to R&D. But on this basis, we would see business freed from the leg iron of BEE and employment equity. South Africa more able to compete on the global stage and to attract investment into the country. An impetus to growth developing again, but of course we do need other reforms as well. And as there is growth, then jobs will begin to expand again. And through the second leg of EED, through the vouchers that we're talking about, better education, better housing, better healthcare, people will be better positioned to take part in that growing economy. So we see economic empowerment for the disadvantaged in a nutshell as having three elements. It reaches down to the grassroots. It doesn't deal only with the relative elite. It identifies the people it wants to help on the basis of socio-economic status, not race. So we can dispense with the race classification that is so divisive. And thirdly, it creates a situation in which business can more easily invest, contribute to growth, contribute to employment, and all South Africans can start to have the benefit of a growing economy. So that's the sort of vision that we have in terms of an alternative empowerment strategy. And one of the most important, we think, if we're looking at the reaching down to the grassroots element, is the education vouchers. And there's been some important work being done on that.
So, Anthea, I mean, I think essentially what we are discussing is what is the appropriate role for the state in producing economic development. And one of the things I quite like about your EED proposal is that we're saying, well, listen, let's try to capture the power of markets and free choice in the example of schools empowering parents to choose schools based on various performance metrics and cost and availability, location, etc. But you're still providing for some degree of welfare, but you're channeling that welfare in a way that's effective, that produces other positive outcomes. And obviously, the more you're spreading the load, the less burden you're putting on the government to be both the provider of welfare and also the provider of the service, which creates conflicts of interest and lack of performance incentive.
Yes, and unfortunately, we know that the government is particularly bad at providing many goods and services, partly because of employment equity, cadre deployment, and Black economic empowerment. So many of the tenders, as we've been hearing through the State Capture Commission, involve inflated prices, involve something very close to fraud or corruption. So if we can separate it, say the government, of course, must gather the taxes, and the government should allocate the taxes to where they are most needed, but they don't need to be involved in the nitty-gritty of providing education or providing healthcare, other than through the public hospitals and clinics we already have, or the housing area in particular, where people are particularly able to start getting on with the job of building their own homes if they had the help of a voucher from the government, and if the government would do what it needs to do, which is to make service land available. So one can see a sort of much more efficient division of labor, as it were, where the government focuses on what it can do well, and ordinary people, with the benefit of the vouchers, I'm very confident would have an enormous interest in making sure they get the maximum value from that money, which has effectively been allocated to meeting certain of their needs. So we could expect a great deal more efficiency in the use of tax revenue than we have, so long as it remains all vested in a bureaucratic and often corrupt state.
In South Africa, we distribute approximately 18 million income grants of various types per annum. And that number is far greater than the number of people who have jobs. I think the latest figures, only about 16 million people have formal employment in South Africa. And what I think is interesting about that is lamentable that we have such a high dependency on welfare, although for many of those people, that is the difference between extreme poverty and survival. So I don't think necessarily that that's a problem to be providing some kind of state support, just a question of who gets that. And also it's much preferable to have people making their own living, generating their own incomes rather than fostering a dependency on the state. And, I think a lot of critics of the EED policy say, well, look, race is the best proxy that we have for disadvantage. Black people were oppressed under apartheid, therefore they are inherently disadvantaged. But we already have a non-racial way of distributing welfare, and that is the existing SASSA system, the welfare distribution system. So you could apply that very effectively to other assessments of need, whether it's education, housing, or healthcare.
Indeed, you put your finger on it, David. We have a system which is in operation already, which applies a means test in deciding who should obtain social grants. And so that system can simply be extended into these other spheres. And the housing voucher, for example, would be earmarked. It can only be used for housing expenditure. The same thing with the schooling voucher. So it isn't as if the government will be distributing a great deal of revenue, which people could spend in a whole range of ways, and then still having to deal with education, housing, and healthcare needs. It's rather that the money would be directed, but directed to people who are poor on the means test, will have an interest in using it to the best effect, and will be able to shop around among a whole number of potential suppliers. This, of course, businesses will have a real interest in meeting the needs of these new customers. And there will be obviously an impetus to efficiency and the controlling of costs in this situation of competition.
So, Anthea, I'd like to explore the role of business in South Africa a bit more closely. So, on the one hand, they seem to be quite positive around BEE, even though some of the negative externalities are really quite evident, and all of the internal contradictions that you've mentioned, the way it fosters corruption, etc. Why do you think BEE has been supported so actively by the business community in South Africa?
Well, I expect it's really because it seems very difficult to oppose something which the government says is the crucial means of providing redress. I think given our past, there's obviously a great need for redress, and there's obviously a great need for many more people to be drawn into the economy. One wants to see that. And perhaps there hasn't been given enough thought, has not been given to an alternative, because business, I think, I'm sure, is well aware of all the difficulties with BEE, all the inefficiencies that it generates, the high costs of having to meet racial quotas in employment, particularly if those become mandatory under the bill that's now being pushed through Parliament. The high cost of doing BEE deals, where I think it was Professor William Gamede said at the end of December 2019 that R1 trillion had not been allocated to BEE deals. It's an enormous amount of money. And we've had indicators for many years from finance ministers in the National Treasury that there's an enormous wastage in the preferential procurement sphere in the public sector. And Pravin Gordhan, when he was first appointed finance minister in 2009, said, the government is paying too much for everything, 40 million rand for a school that should cost 15 million. That's indicating that it's not just a 10 or 20% markup that's happening for BEE. It's more than 100% markup. And this is enormously wasteful. I'm sure the private sector, when it engages in preferential procurement, tries to avoid that kind of waste. But there is nevertheless a sense that you can't just pick the people you want to contract with on the basis of price, efficiency, and capacity to deliver. And the moment you bring in other criteria, race in particular, it's a new element, and it may not work as well as the established ones. So why doesn't business oppose it? I think it's very difficult to go out on a limb and criticize it openly. I think the media has also been very supportive of what the government has said. You haven't had much critical coverage of whether employment equity and BEE are really working. Ironically, some of the strongest criticism has come from the South African Communist Party, which has said that BEE is the reason for our rising inequality, and have highlighted this distinction between the few who do very well and the great majority who remain unemployed. So perhaps business also needs to have a greater awareness of what the alternative might be. Because if there's an alternative, it becomes easier to say, let's push towards a different idea. Just to say we don't like BEE is likely to be taken quite badly by the government. We've seen how the DA, for example, has been castigated for not caring sufficiently about the Black poor, which is not true. What the DA is also trying to say is there's a better means of helping the Black poor, and doesn't lie in BEE. I'm sure business doesn't want to attract that kind of negative coverage. But if business could say, we think there's a better way, and we would like to put our resources and our capacities behind that better way, and we would like to see a real upsurge in growth, investment, employment, prosperity. And at the same time, we'd like to do whatever we can to help that shift of resources down to the grassroots, make sure that the vouchers are really working for the poor to meet their needs for education, housing, healthcare. And there are many things that business could do in that sphere. To earn extra EED points, you could top up vouchers for the poorest in rural areas. You could help develop more effective ways of using technology to improve teaching. Any number of things where business already has an established expertise and could help improve the quality overall. But I think there needs to be an alternative, or it's a very difficult thing to do to oppose BEE, given how heavily invested the government has been in it.
And of course, business stands to benefit that if some of this state funding were to be redirected via these vouchers into private enterprises, then there could be an upside for them. And we have seen the emergence of low-fee private schools, such as the Spark schools in South Africa. There's clearly pent-up demand for high-quality, affordable schooling in South Africa.
Absolutely. I think that's evident both from Spark schools and also from Curro. And both are also actually now expanding in Soweto because they have recognized that there's a big need there. So many families living in township areas are getting their children up at the crack of dawn, putting them on taxis at 4 a.m. in the morning to send them to suburban schools far away, and are infinitely happy if they can send them to good schools just around the corner. And that's really what the education voucher idea opens up, that entrepreneurs will see the opportunity and can, like the Spark schools, start setting up schools which are convenient to people, which are close to where they are actually living. And the public schools in township areas would also have to up their game. At the moment, pupils come to them whether they do well or not. Some of them have done so badly that they've effectively been abandoned. Where you do have an abandoned school, what we really need to see is an entrepreneur taking it over, and people in the area equipped with education vouchers being able now to send their children to a school which has been brought back to life and which now functions on a very much more effective and efficient basis because it's all the private sector's capacities and skills are brought to bear in making sure that what is offered is appropriate for the children, exactly what they need to learn, and that they're doing it in a manner which is competitive and cost effective.
So, Anthea, this all seems very sensible, but there are significant political obstacles in the way of such a policy being implemented. Just one that comes to the top of my mind is the role of the teachers' unions in South Africa. The SADTU, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, was the first port of call on Cyril Ramaphosa's 2017 campaign to become president of the ANC. And that will not be easily and quickly forgotten. And I think he'd be reluctant to kind of challenge the power and influence of the unions. What would you think are strategies that we could perhaps sidestep some of these obstacles?
Yeah, that's one of the $64,000 questions, because it is very difficult to see how one can circumvent union resistance. At the moment, of course, the unions are particularly organized in public schools. So what we're largely talking about here, certainly what James Toohey is talking about, are private schools, which are run by entrepreneurs and which achieve all these very good results. And obviously, teachers would be free to form unions in those private schools if they wanted to. But it may be a way to begin with of making the union presence not as strong. But perhaps there may also be a value in the fact that the public schools have to start competing for the custom of children. So the unions may also begin to recognize that the jobs of teachers do depend on being able to attract that custom. And so, if a public school cannot attract any customers, any parents armed with vouchers, in the end, it will really have no option but to close. The government will, even this government will see no value in keeping open an empty school. And it's been closing quite a number of schools around the country because parents have been voting with their children's feet. and sending them to suburban schools. So that might also concentrate the minds of teachers. I think very often in the unions, there's probably a distinction between what the rank and file members think and what the union leaders think. And the rank and file members, particularly if they can be protected by some of the new labor relations rules about not being forced to go out on strike, having the right to a secret ballot before a strike can be called and so on, might be able to express more of their own views. Because one often wonders if there isn't a difference between how ordinary union members feel and about what the more politicized leaders say. And I think there would be less intimidation and coercion in strikes if the leaders felt confident that they had solid support from the members. So it's one of the big issues. Ideally, one also needs to be able to reform labor law more so that the union power is tempered really by sensible provisions to make sure that members can't be coerced into things that they don't really want to do. And that's not being unfair to unionists. It's just saying that we need to have a set of rules that is balanced and that does not result in coercion and intimidation of anybody. The other thing that perhaps we need to deal with politically is the belief that the state must be involved in education. And this, I think, is a belief that's widespread around the world. But if, again, you go back into history, and I'm quoting James Tooley again, I haven't had the time to do this research myself, but there is research in both the US and the UK, which shows very effective private schooling working as early as 1820, 1830 in both of those countries, in the US and New York in particular, in the UK and many different parts of the country, including rural areas. Their education was done privately, to some extent by the church and by voluntary organizations, to some extent by for-profit schools. But there was a very high degree of literacy, numeracy, and so on, a high quality of teaching, even before the state became involved. And perhaps we've all forgotten that. We've all come to assume that the state needs to be in charge. And surely the state does need to fund through tax revenues, but the state doesn't have to be in charge. And private enterprise can do a much better job.
And sometimes the state can actually crowd out the private sector. And, I certainly think that the role of charitable organizations, private profit-seeking organizations, they can fulfill many kind of positive roles and satisfy a need that exists in the market.
Yes, and again, the individuals involved in those organizations are likely to have a much more personal interest in doing the best possible job. Whereas I'm afraid, once it's a bureaucracy that's involved in it, you probably get a rather tick box mentality coming in. And unfortunately, we have many examples of our public service not being particularly efficient and not really meriting the large amount that it is paid. So we need to look for alternatives that we can improve really cost effectiveness and efficiency and the outcomes that we're able to secure.
Yeah, and I think something that struck me throughout this conversation, Anthea, is the sense of the perils of overly centralized public policy, where you identify a social problem, whatever it might be, education, healthcare, etc., and you think, well, the government must do something about this, and therefore we need to have a centralized department that consolidates the curriculum, that makes all the decisions on behalf of everyone in the country. The people's interests and needs are different, and often local communities are much more sensitive to those interests and needs. And so what I like about your policy proposal is that it empowers those local communities to craft policies or to offer a service that is sensitive to the needs of their own community.
Yes, that decentralization does really offer choice at the grassroots. And business, of course, is very good at identifying what it is that people would like to have, what they would like to buy. And then, of course, through the market mechanism, making those goods and services available. And so you get the vast choice that is available through the private sector.
Anthea, you've outlined some of the problems with the current system of BEE, but many people say, well, BEE hasn't worked for various reasons. We just haven't done BEE in the right way. And if we tweak the system, if we double down on this policy, we'll have outcomes that are more aligned with our expectations. What do you think about that? Can BE be fixed?
I think it absolutely can't be. And one of the key reasons is that it's chasing an impossible goal. It's supposed to be achieving the norm, as it's called, of demographic representativity. And this is the idea that Black, white, colored Indian people would, in the absence of racism, fan out into the economy, into business, into jobs, and exactly in accordance with their share of the overall population. But that's not a norm. If it were a norm, you would find it present in many heterogeneous societies. In fact, it's a myth in every heterogeneous society. And this has been carefully explored by Thomas Sowell, one of the most renowned economists in the US, and other scholars in the US as well, who've really done a very careful study of this. And what they have found is the myth rather than the norm. And what explains it? Government has an obvious interest in saying this is the norm so that they can guide policy accordingly and punish people for not attaining the supposed norm. But the reality of the myth is founded in the fact that everybody is different. We aren't all blank slates, and we're not all sort of fungible little units that can be slotted here and slotted there and slotted anywhere else. In fact, all individuals differ in their interests, in their values, their experiences, their skills, and in a whole number of variables which actually have an impact on the sorts of jobs they're likely to do, and with what level of success. And so you need to recognize that the goal is an impossible goal for any country in the world. It's particularly difficult in South Africa because of the age and skills profile here, if I could just explain. And if we take the Employment Equity Act, that is asking business and the public service to aspire to demographic representativity. That at the end of the day, because African people make up 79% of the economically active population, they should also make up 79% of the workforce at every level, from the most senior down to the most junior. But the economically active population, of course, includes all people between the ages of 15 and 64 who either work or would like to work, even though they've never had the chance to do so. So using the economically active population as the kind of benchmark is unrealistic, particularly because we have a very young population. Roughly half of South Africans are under the age of 25. And people in that sort of age group can't possibly be eligible for senior posts or professional posts. So we could say, well, anybody over the age of 35 is more geared to middle or senior management. And let's look at that group, 35 to 64. And we find that Black people make up 46% of that group. So 46% would be a more tangible, more reachable objective than 79%. But even that is too high, because very often you do need degrees. They're either advisable or they're necessary for middle and senior management jobs. And if we look at the Black population with degrees, it's only 5% who are in that category because of our history. And many of them are fairly recent graduates who haven't had the opportunity to develop all the years of experience on the job, which are needed for senior posts. So we've set a thoroughly unrealistic target. In the public service, it's almost being met. And that is part of the reason why efficiency in the public service is so diminished. Now the government is looking through the Employment Equity Amendment Bill for the private sector also to meet that kind of target. But we don't have the age and the skills profile that allows it. And the more that business is pushed into appointing people to senior levels before they're ready for those positions, because no matter what your skin color, fundamentally you need experience and knowledge to be able to do a job, then there is likely to be a diminution in efficiency and competitiveness within the private sector, which business, of course, can't sustain, because business does not have regular injections of taxpayers' money irrespective of their performance. Business has to be competitive within the country and very often abroad. So it's a major problem that we're trying to reach this impossible goal. And no matter how much we tighten up the laws, as the government is now trying to do it, it's not going to change the age and skills profile. That can't be changed overnight. It can change gradually over time. but we can't expect to have a very quick change and still have efficiency in our in the private sector. And we can see all the risks of what happens if you try to go too fast from the experience of the public service.
Anthea Jeffery, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I think it is worth putting this idea of an alternative form of empowerment out into the public domain and getting people talking about ways in which we can change our current system and rectify some of the problems with it. Thank you for joining us on Solutions with David Ansara. We are publishing an episode every Sunday at 6 p.m. So do look out for that. And remember, if you're watching on YouTube, to subscribe to the channel and also subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. And until next time, take care.